All right, our guest today is Professor Carol Berkin. She is the Presidential Professor of History at Baruch College and a member of the History faculty of the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's written several other books, including First Generations, Women of Colonial America, A Brilliant Solution, Inventing the American Constitution, and Civil War Wives. She's also been a consultant on several PBS and History Channel documentaries, including PBS's Alexander Hamilton. She serves on the board of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History and also on the board of the National Council for History Education. And her book that we're going to be talking about today is Revolutionary Mothers, Women in the Struggle for America's Independence. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And Professor Berkin, it's absolutely fantastic to have you here on Book Breaks. Welcome.
Thank you, thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, we're so glad to have you. So to kick off our conversation, it's usually how I kind of always kick off a Book Breaks conversation is, what originally inspired you to write this book?
Oh, all the male troglodytes who kept omitting women from the story of the American Revolution. I remember picking up a book, the author will be nameless, that was about yay thick, and it purported to be the absolute total history of the American Revolution. So I went to the index. The word women did not appear, and there was not the name of a single woman in it. And I thought, okay, I think we better tell them again what we had told them. I mean, Mary Beth Norton, Linda Kerber, Nancy Cott, there were books galore about this subject. I mean, we couldn't name every single woman who had ever appeared in the American Revolution, but we were pretty close. So I decided, okay, it's time to sort of nudge them again. And that really prompted the writing of Revolutionary Mothers. It was a kind of revenge book, I guess.
And what I found really interesting in reading the introduction to the book was, as you mentioned, Elizabeth Elliot's Women of the American Revolution, and it was this massive volume, and you talk about that three volumes, and that women, the role of women in the American Revolution actually was talked about right after the Revolution and for the first few decades. What happened? Why is it that story seemingly disappeared by the latter half of the 19th century?
It was a kind of gender amnesia. But what really happened, I must tell you, is the profession happened. Elizabeth Elliot didn't have a degree from anywhere. She wasn't a professor anywhere. She was what would be called sneeringly an antiquarian. You know, she wrote for the pleasure of writing history. So did many other people, male and female. The Germans provided two important institutions to America: kindergarten and graduate school. And graduate school produced professional historians. Well, of course, women weren't allowed to go to graduate school in the 19th century. And so all of them were males. And they wrote about what they thought were the important topics: generals, presidents, vice presidents, secretaries of state, more war, more. They wrote about traditionally masculine topics. And women simply vanished. They didn't hold political office. They didn't give speeches in legislatures. And so they were not worthy of being recorded in history. It wasn't seriously, here and there, Mary Beard wrote a book, Women as a Force in History, but not specifically about American women. It wasn't until the 1960s when graduate school opened up for a variety of political reasons, largely the Cold War, opened its doors to all sorts of people who'd never attended, working class men, of African Americans, women, because they needed to fill professorial slots at the expanding numbers of colleges. And eventually, many of us, and I always tell my graduate students this is true, all the women historians I know wrote their first book about men. I mean, that if you had said to your advisor, I want to write a book about, in fact, I did say to my advisor about women, and he said, oh, that would be lovely, Carol, but there's nothing to say, and there are no sources. I mean, he was a wonderful, wonderful person, and later willingly ate his words, but we all waited till we got tenure before we rebelled. And I tell my students, if you're planning to rebel, wait till you get tenure. And we began to produce literally hundreds of books about women in American history, filling in all those gender amnesia gaps right up until the present day. What we found, of course, those of us who toiled in the field of early American history, was there were as many sources as anyone could ever imagine there being. It's just that they were cataloged in ways that hid them. You know that movie Hidden Figures? Well, we had hidden documents. It would say, Sam Jones, public papers, political writings, business material, personal correspondence. And then down at the bottom, it would say miscellaneous documents. And that's where all the women's material was. Mary Beth Norton has a very funny story. She says she used to leave notes. We used to, all of us, to one another saying, don't believe them, there are women's documents here. And ultimately, archivists re-inventoried and re-cataloged their holdings to demonstrate, not all of them, but most from major institutions, to indicate that there were scores of written documents by white, middle, and upper class women. And then things like the computer that allowed you to do, I did not do this, I'm not a statistician, but you could take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of accounts of slave women and how much they cost and run them through a program and you could come up with collective portraits of people who didn't leave individual letters. Then we discovered court records and on and on and on, so that now really we have enough sources that we could continue to write books for the next 50 years. And that's been the most exciting part of being in women's history, that it's an endless journey of discovery for all of us.
That's fantastic. I know many, pardon me, many of our audience are teachers and students, so they are absolutely appreciative knowing that the sources are out there for this history. Now, within the book, it's fascinating as you start the book out talking about the traditional gender roles, and that women were really just, no matter what, even if it was working on the farm and being industrious helper to the husband, or the urban housewife, so to speak, taking care of the household, no matter what, it was this limited concept of being a helpmate to the husband, really almost just an addition to the husband's identity.
Absolutely. There are men today who'd like to see that come back too.
Unfortunately. But it's fascinating, and then the following chapters that you start talking about the important role that women played in the lead up to the revolution, and that their first political act was saying no. Can you talk a little bit more about that, please?
There were many radical consequences of the American Revolution, but I think one of the most radical ones is the instant politicization of women. They had been enjoined by ministers, by public leaders, by opinion makers through all the decades of colonial history to be quiet and to not concern themselves with what we would call today public or civic matters. All of a sudden, after the Stamp Act, when the men in the legislatures introduced the boycott of British goods. The only way they could orate till the cows came home, and the British Parliament couldn't have cared less. You know, what did they care what these rubes in America said? We were at the center of the empire in London. But they got smart, and they did exactly what, for instance, Martin Luther King would do many centuries later: hit them where it hurt in their economy. And so they didn't have the word boycott yet. It wasn't invented yet. So they passed non-importation and non-consumption appeals. And the major things to not consume and not to buy were textiles, were cloth, because that was the engine of the British Industrial Revolution. And who dealt with cloth? Women. And so without women's willingness to boycott cloth, to boycott tea services, to boycott later on tea itself, chocolate, all the indicators of middle and upper class life, the boycotts wouldn't have succeeded. And so women were drawn, it was like a magnet, drew women into spinning cloth. They spun homespun for the first time in years and years and years. And they realized very quickly that what they were doing was political. They called what they spun liberty cloth, and they referred to themselves as daughters of liberty. That shows a consciousness. They put notices in newspapers. Women never were mentioned in newspapers, and they certainly never wrote to newspapers. And they would send notices signed by 20, 30, 40, 100 women saying, we, the undersigned, are going to refuse to purchase English tea until liberty is restored to America, until this British tyranny ends. And they were careful to say in many cases, we are not doing this because our husbands told us to. We are doing this because we are daughters of liberty. And so overnight, women were politicized. And a lot of men then thought this was the most hard, this was the beginning of anarchy. This was the end of civilization. But the men leading the protests applauded like crazy. There was a minister in South Carolina who for his entire career had enjoined women to be silent in the church and pay no attention to politics, just to tend their own gardens and take care of their households. Now he writes a sermon, the hills themselves will sing the praises of the daughters of liberty. I mean, it was like one morning you woke up and everything had changed. And this is what I try to convey in that chapter about the years before the Declaration of Independence, that one young girl wrote, I love this phrase, we commenced perfect statesmen. And so this transformation was, I think, one of the great radical moments of the American Revolution.
And what I really appreciated through the book, and what I found really fascinating, is not only the stories of these women, but also how it also kind of adjusts our view of the Revolutionary War as well. And you talk about, in the introduction, we almost have a quaint, harmless view of the Revolution, but that it was a bitter civil war and a brutal home front war. Can you talk a little bit about how women's experiences within the conflict brought this idea of a civil war and a home front war to life?
Yes, it was a war that lasted over 7 years, and it was fought on American soil. It was fought in towns, in villages. It was fought in people's fields, in their backyards. Obviously, it affected everyone. More than anything else, as soon as independence was declared, a lot of things women desperately needed to keep their families going and keep them fed and alive were cut off by the British. in that dreadful movie, 1776, Abigail Adams, which I forbid my students to ever watch. Abigail Adams sings, "Pins, John, pins. We can't sew without pins." But the real crisis was salt, because they couldn't preserve food for the winter without salt. So they became innovators. They rose to the occasion extraordinarily, and they came up with substitutes for salt, and they came up with different kinds. In fact, Starbucks should award them a prize, because they came up with herbal tea to replace the pico tea coming from India with it. They made corn liquor and rye liquor, which they fed to the they served up to the American soldiers as they marched by. They were extraordinary, I think, in their efforts to cope with what was really we should understand it now, because we are going through a pandemic where people's ingenuity and their willingness to make sacrifices are what are keeping us afloat. And that's what women did. Their husbands went off to war. They were left taking care of the farm. They were left trying to figure out, with incredible inflation and scarcity of goods, how to take care of their children. So this was, you can understand the nitty-gritty of war by understanding what women wrote and what women said about the difficulties that they faced. The same thing, by the way, is true in the American Civil War. You cannot really understand the cost of the Civil War or the siege of Richmond till you read Verena Howell Davis's journal about women taking apart carpet bags and making shoes out of them because they had no shoes. So you see this in the American Revolution. And also what you see is all these iconic images, men stomping through the snow at Valley Forge. Only men are so untrue. Valley Forge and every single winter encampment during the war suddenly became urban centers, became cities, because women who were afraid of being raped by the invading army, afraid that they couldn't feed their children, afraid that they would freeze to death because they didn't have any wood, who were tired of having everything in their house stolen by the army, they packed up their families and they moved to where the army was encamped. And they did the cooking, they did the mending, they did the nursing, they did the laundry, they did everything that today's army has a quartermaster corps for. So Valley Forge was a booming city. It wasn't just a gang of guys together passing the time, inventing games. So much of what we think the war was about is missing a richness because we haven't talked about women. In the forts, these women, by the way, who went to the camps were called camp followers. And when I first started the research on this, I thought that camp followers were prostitutes. No, they were wives, daughters, sweethearts, mothers of the soldiers. And when they went and joined their significant others in the forts, they ran across open spaces in the forts when they were under attack to bring pitchers of water to the cannoneers. You had to cool down the cannon in order to reload it. And they were wounded. I mean, the cannonballs and the arrows are coming over the fortress walls, the fort walls. And we have 250 applications for veterans' pensions from women who were wounded in these forts. There's absolutely no place that you see the army that you are not going to see women participating, either dressing like men and going to war, like the most famous one is Deborah Sampson, or following the army when it left winter camp and being sent out onto the field in the middle of a battle to scavenge for weapons and for boots and for coats from the dead and dying soldiers. So if you want to understand the bloodiness, the pain, the suffering of the American Revolution, you can get a lot of it from looking at what women did. They're your window into this. They're your window also into the fact that the American Revolution was the true civil war in America. The Civil War in the 19th century was region against region, but the American Revolution was often brother against brother in the same family, sister against sister in the same family, cousins against one another. You feel, you understand what a wrenching experience deciding whether to be a loyalist or a revolutionary it was by just reading women's letters about the breakup of their families. So there's much to understand, not just about women in the revolution, but about the revolution itself by putting women back in it.
And one of the fascinating things I felt reading the book was also that this was a new experience of war for the colonists, the Americans. Is like, well, like with the camp followers, you write about George Washington actually being annoyed with all of these followers.
George Washington always secretly wanted to have an army, a professional army like the British Army. In fact, he and Charles Lee, their great fight with each other was Charles Lee wanted the whole war fought by the militias. He thought that was more in the style of a republic. And Washington said, I want a professional army. He was so happy when Baron von Steuben came and taught the men how to march in order and how to present arms. And so now suddenly in the camp were women, children, pets. And it did, he was right, it did constrain his movements. In fact, at one point he was trying to move the army quickly, and he writes in his I guess, records of the day, he said, I was trying to move the army and I couldn't because 8 women were in labor and I had to wait until they gave birth. So but he made use of them, and he was smart enough to know that if he sent them home, their men would go with them. He understood that once they were there, that desertions would be massive if he sent these women home. So he had to learn to live with them. But he never was happy about it.
And then what really kind of highlighted this idea of the Civil War is loyalist women were many times left behind by their husbands to care for property. And then even patriot women being home, taking care of everything, now having to be both the wife, the mother, the caretaker of the farm.
Yes.
But then there was always this threat of violence, real physical violence.
Especially in the South. The South, you see it as a bloody civil war more clearly. First of all, the army leaves New England in 1775. And though the formal armies were in Philadelphia and New York, the real 2 major campaigns by the British were in the South. And many backcountry farmers who had been oppressed by the men we call the patriots of the American Revolution, the planters of the coast, they signed up with the British. They were advocates of that old Arab saying, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friends. They wanted to see people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry hanged because they had been taxing these backcountry people and not giving them anything. No roads, no courthouses, no anything. And these men, loyalist troops, fought American troops brutally. The battles between American troops in the South and loyalist troops in the South were filled with atrocities. There are accounts of men on both sides slitting pregnant women from their gullet to their crotch. you know, with their swords. The hatred that was exhibited in the South shows you what a real civil war is like. And women were both victims, and there were women in the South who risked everything. The swamp fox and these guerrilla war fighters in the South who would nip at the British Army when it was there, which was most of the war, would store ammunition and weapons in the cellars of women. And if the British or the Loyalists heard about this, they would come to the house and demand that these things be turned over. I have accounts of women who blew up their own home to prevent the British from getting those troops, who took a sword. One woman took a ceremonial sword from over the fireplace and came out and said, "I will attack you and kill you if you come near my home." We have women who burned their crops to prevent the British Army from getting that wheat or that corn or that rye. I mean, they engaged in acts of heroism or heroic behavior that you can't find in 90% of the books that were written by men. And so I am so glad that those of us in the pioneer days of this field, and now thousands of young women today, young scholars today, just finally said, I wonder what women were doing in the American Revolution. You know, I want to see me. I want to look in the mirror of history, and I want to see myself, which is, of course, what African Americans said as well, and produced African American history. What working class, I don't mean labor union history, I mean working class, the young men who went to graduate school for the first time finally said about their social class. It's expanded American history so much and so well that it's, you know, it's been a pleasure to have been a part of it, a little small part of it.
And speaking of that, there's two fantastic chapters in the book as well about the role of Native American women, and I thought the story of Molly Brant was absolutely fascinating, and African American women. Can you talk a little bit more about their roles in the conflict?
This is another way in which you have a window onto how it was a civil war. Because, and I try to tell my students to think of the American Revolution as three overlapping circles of revolution, all of which have exactly the same ideology. The American patriots fighting for liberty, freedom, independence. Native Americans who largely sided with the British because they knew the Americans were the land grabbers extraordinaire. They were fighting. Ask Molly Brant. She said, we are fighting for our independence, for the preservation of our culture, for our freedom. And ask every African-American woman who, wherever the British Army settled, whenever it arrived within 100 miles of the plantation they were on, picked up their babies, took their children, took their elderly parents if they could, and walked to what they thought would be the freedom and independence they would find with the British Army. The same rhetoric from all three groups, fighting often against one another. The American Revolution was much more complex than just the Minutemen and Paul Revere fighting against the evil, terrible King of England, which he wasn't, but that's another story. It was other Americans fighting for the preservation of their culture, the preservation of their independence, the preservation of their liberty. When, before the revolution began in Virginia, the governor of Virginia, Dunsmore, issued a proclamation and said any African-American slave who abandons their master will be given freedom. So many black men abandoned their masters, and women as well. And they formed something they called the Ethiopian Regiment. And across their chests, they wore a banner with one word on it: liberty. You know, give me liberty or give me death. In their case, they got death. But it's the same principle that that Patrick Henry thought he was willing to die for. And you can see this. You can have a window into this when you look at what women did. They can act as a kind of guide to the complexity of the American Revolution.
I wish we could talk for the rest of the day, but this is going to have to be my last question to you, because we already have a ton of questions from the audience.
Okay.
But in the conclusion of the book, I found it incredibly fascinating and in some ways sad that there was a great deal of debate and conversation about women after the revolution, and that, oh, maybe we should start educating women properly, not just, needlework and manners, but because they need to be good defenders of the Republic, because they're in charge of taking care of the next generation of Americans. But it almost comes with a twist that it once again limits women to the world of domesticity.
Exactly.
And can you talk a little bit more about that? And then also for our teachers and students out there teaching this in the classrooms, these kind of nuances that we've just talked about, and making it a bigger picture of history as well.
Yes. In a way, this new ideology for women was a tender trap. It gave women a civic responsibility. You are to raise up sons and daughters willing to sacrifice their lives as their parents did to preserve the Republic. But you are to do it in a domestic setting, and you are still going to be completely economically dependent on your husband. You are not going to be able to sue or be sued. You are not going to be able to will property to anybody. Your body still belongs to your husband, but you are going to have an important role in your society, which was better than not having an important role in their society. The one thing women did get, middle and upper class women, was education. They said, if we're going to teach our children, we have to know the history of the British Empire and the history of America. We have to know moral philosophy. We have to know law. And they did create young ladies' academies in every single one of the new states. And we all know as teachers that education is a dangerous thing. It gives you the vocabulary to speak out, and it gives you the understanding that this is not a personal problem, this is a systemic problem. It took about 70 years to get to Seneca Falls, but in the great chronology of American history, in the timeline of history, 70 years is just a tiny blip. So that gain in education really gives a baseline for the women's movement in the next century. There are so many sources now available online for teachers. There are so many books. Three friends of mine did a book called In Her Own Words, which is this thick, and it has letters, documents, everything you could ever want by women and about women. So these resources are so readily available, and half of your students, unless you teach at the Citadel, well, maybe even there they have women now, but unless you teach in a boys' school, and they need to hear this more even than the girls do, they need to see themselves in the past. They need to know that women were not passive creatures, that history wasn't done to them, but that they did history. And so I urge you, whenever possible, to use primary sources, material culture, letters, diaries, statistics, whatever, to show them agency, that is action by women, that it will, you'll see your girl students' eyes open up instead of them sitting there thinking, well, none of this is about me. You want them to know the past is about them also. So I know most teachers already know this and are doing it. The teachers I encounter are absolutely amazing, really. But just as a reminder, get women into every story you tell.
Well, Professor Berkin, thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Allison, and she's going to ask you all these great questions, which there are a lot from the audience.
Thank you. Allison, only ask me questions I can answer.
Okay, I will do my best. I will do my very best. Let's see here. Our first question comes from Ellen, and Ellen is a teacher from Pearland, Texas. She asks, did Abigail Adams' call to remember the ladies at the time of the Constitution ever get any organizational power behind it, or was it mostly an isolated plea that fell on deaf ears?
It was an isolated plea. She was not part of an incipient feminist movement. And it was written just to her husband. And you must remember that she was not asking for the vote. She was not asking for the right to political office. She was asking for the reform of the marriage laws that made women so totally dependent on their husbands. And I would argue that had she gotten that, we would have been enjoying equal rights much faster than just getting the vote. John's response was, ha, ha, ha. And when she wrote a second letter saying, John, I'm serious, he wrote words to this effect, shut up. So no, she didn't really have much impact on, she was not one of those intellectuals like Susanna Rowson or Mercy Otis Warren or Judith Sargent Murray, who were part of an intelligentsia who really discussed what role should women have. She was basically a farm, she managed the farm and she advised her husband.
Oh, Mr. Adams.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question comes from Pete, and Pete asks, based on what you have described about how women contributed to the war effort and to society, why did it take nearly 150 years for them to get the right to vote? Did the male-dominated society feel that women were given enough rights to appease them?
No one gives up power, as you should know from reading the newspaper. No one gives up power willingly. What Adam says to his wife is, oh, you know, we live under the domination of the petticoat as it is. Ha, 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 ha. You don't need any more rights. You don't need any rights. And men continue to say that right up, as I said, until, what time is it now? There are men still saying that, right? That why give up your privilege? Why give up the fact that you can decide most things? And so it's not surprising at all that it took many decades of concerted, organized effort to even get the vote.
All right, our next question comes from Nancy, and Nancy is a fifth grade teacher. Nancy asks, do you think the popularity of Hamilton will help more Americans realize the role that women played in our country's history, and perhaps more books including women in history that will increase the popularity? Nancy also says that she struggles finding age-appropriate biographies of women to help inspire young women, and wants to know if you have any suggestions.
There's a book about Sybil Luddington, who was, they call her the Paul Revere of women, but in fact, since she completed her ride to call out her father's militia, and Paul Revere never completed his ride, I think he should be called the Sybil Luddington of men. But small book written by a teacher from Putnam County, New York, and it's available in paperback, and I think your kids would love it. I think they could read it. You are right that there is a paucity of good books that are not presentist. I'm asked to review books about colonial women and women in the Revolution all the time, meant for school kids, that really write as if they were 21st century women, but they were wearing different clothes. And so I have trouble recommending any of them, but I think the book about Sybil Luddington would be a good start.
Great, thank you. The next question is from William from New Fairfield, Connecticut. And William asks, with the American victory in the Revolution and the moment for national self-definition that necessarily ensued, how much sentiment existed for inclusion of women in notions of republicanism and equality? Why, for example, did the New Jersey Women's Suffrage Initiative during the war become reversed and lose traction?
Right. It was not really their initiative. The men in the New Jersey legislature, state legislature in 1776 were firm believers at that moment in, in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they wrote a constitution that said all New Jersey citizens who owned property and were free could vote. And so free African Americans voted, and there were widows and single women who did, and they did vote. The Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia has done a fabulous exhibit on this, and they have produced educational materials. Contact them. They have just done an amazing job with this. But the women didn't organize to get this. It was given to them. The second New Jersey Constitution confirmed this. It said his or her. But the New Jersey women voted on the whole for Federalists. And the Republicans, the Jeffersonians in New Jersey, didn't like this. They were trying to seize power in New Jersey. And so they mounted a campaign to disenfranchise women. And in the next legislature, the next revision of the Constitution in the early 19th century, they succeeded. Jefferson had become president, they were dominating, and there went the right of women in New Jersey to vote. Republican womanhood, that is that civic duty to raise patriotic children, was the place they thought the leaders, the opinion makers decided was where women fit into the Republic.
So speaking of women and their husbands, Mike from Newport, Rhode Island asks, were there any examples of women not siding with their husbands when taking a side in the revolution?
Yes, there are accounts of women who did not support. Well, let me give you an example, not of women and their husbands, but women and their parents. Henry Knox's wife, Lucy Flucker Knox, and all her documents are in the Gilda Lehrman collection. Her parents, she was an only child, her parents were ardent loyalists, and they fled the country. And she was left all alone in America because her husband was an ardent revolutionary. And I can't bring to mind immediately the names of these women, but there were women who either were loyalists and their husbands were revolutionaries, or there certainly were sisters like Dorothy Quincy, who married John Hancock, and Esther Quincy, who married Jonathan Sewell, who was one of the leading loyalists in Massachusetts. So families were split apart by this choice of loyalties.
The next question comes from Jennifer in Casa Grande, Arizona. Jennifer asks, which one American Revolution mother should we have a national holiday named after?
Oh, wow. Why stop at one? Let's
right,
have...
no pressure, no pressure.
That's a hard question. I mean, if you want to have a heroine, maybe Deborah Sampson, because she disguised herself as a man and she fought in the war and she got a pension and right. If you want to talk about laying down intellectual groundwork for women's rights, I would pick Judith Sargent Murray, whose Gleaner essays were quite remarkable. If you want a woman who was engaged in writing propaganda, Mercy Otis Warren. I would be loath to pick, maybe you can just have a triptych with heroines in the war, propagandists, and feminist thinkers, and that could be the celebration. But
Fair
certainly
enough.
There should be things that honor women in the American Revolution.
I am inclined to agree with that. Our next question comes from Tim. Tim is in Columbia, South Carolina, and asks, which of these specific women you discuss in your book did you find the most interesting?
Well, actually, the two women, I think Mammy Kate is in the book. There were two women in the chapter on spies, saboteurs, messengers. I don't think Nancy Hart got in there, but my favorite absolute figure is a woman who captured 5 loyalist soldiers. And the other is Mammy Kate, who was a black slave woman on a plantation of Stephen Hurd in Georgia. Stephen Hurd was a little bitty guy, and Mammy Kate was a great big strapping black woman. And when he was captured by the British, she went to Augusta and she managed to carry him out in a laundry basket on her head. So, I mean, there are just so many there, but I will tell you this, no female who rode out to bring a message between generals or to rally the militia or to carry a message to anyone ever rode out except on a dark and stormy night. All the oral history that is passed down about all of these women is always, it was a dark and stormy night. They never got any good weather, any balmy evenings to go out. And they're all, you can pick in the book. I catalog a whole series of stories about women who were spies and saboteurs and messengers. And you can pick the one you like best.
All right, our next question is from 2 different people who asked very similar questions. Mary Beth from Arlington, Virginia, and Terry from Anchorage, Alaska. Woo! Opposite ends of the country, all the way apart.
I've been to Anchorage to talk to teachers 3 times.
Oh, I love Anchorage. I love it so much. It's so beautiful. But they are wondering about the view of women in Great Britain, of American women who were involved in this. So one asker says, I know the British political establishment scoffed at the role of women in the revolutionary cause, but did the actions of women in the colonies awaken women in Britain at all? Did it impact women globally, or was it seen as a peculiar, uniquely American phenomenon?
In fact, if anything, the arrows come in the other direction. Wollstonecraft and Catherine Macaulay, who were 2 towering figures in Great Britain, influenced people like Mercy Otis Warren and Judith Sargent Murray. To the best of my knowledge, and I have not studied British history from this point of view, but to the best of my knowledge, they did not they were not influenced by what American women said or did.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions, and this question comes from Vaughn from New York. We talked a little bit earlier about Black voices and the revolution, and Vaughn is wondering who were some of the Black female revolutionary voices, specifically?
There were very few. First of all, it's very hard to find written documents by African American women because most of them were illiterate. That is, they couldn't read or write. And they certainly didn't have time if they worked on a rice plantation to keep a diary. Almost all the affective, that is how I feel about something, materials we have come from white, middle and upper class women. We do have Phyllis Wheatley, the poet who was a slave brought over from Africa and was adopted by a childless couple in Massachusetts and educated, and she became a poet. And Washington read her poems. But they were not specifically ever about women. They were about the glorious revolution in America and the creation of a republic. I would be hard pressed to name any other, it could just be my ignorance, but I don't know of any other Black women who put down on paper anything that we could access. Molly Brandt, who was a Native American woman, her family was a Christian middle-class family in New York. She was married to a white man. She was highly articulate. She was, in fact, the diplomat for the Mohawks. She negotiated land for them in Canada. We have things she wrote, but I can't think of anyone besides Phyllis Wheatley.
All right, and Professor Berkin, we have time for 1 more question. This comes from Matthew, and Matthew says, you originally published this book in 2005. Have the ensuing 15 years made you want to revisit any elements of this book? Would you emphasize anything more or less?
That's a wonderful question. This book still is used in classrooms across the country. I mean, it's still in print and it's in its, I don't know what number print. If I were to do a book again, you know, I don't want to commit myself to anything that may not be the case. I think I would look more closely at the ways in which women did not conform to the gender ideology before the revolution or to Republican motherhood after the revolution. I would nuance that a lot more than I did in the book. I don't think I would try to integrate the story of Black women and Native American women and Loyalist women in with the story of patriot women, because it always winds up looking like, oh, and also, and then I wanted them to have their own chapters. I wanted them to have their own story. And you always get criticized for that. How come you segregated Indian women and Black women? How come you didn't put them in the main? So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. But I think really it would be to have a more nuanced understanding of the gender ideology would be what I would change. But I'm done. I'm done. I retired from teaching. I'm emerita now. And though I do programs like this all the time, I am not going to sit in my study and write another book. 8 books is more than enough. It was, you know, I'm finished. I'm too busy playing with my grandchildren.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Professor.
Thank
Professor
you.
Berkin,
yes.
We're so happy that you wrote this book. It's fantastic. And I'm going to share my screen one more time. Again, thank you for talking with us today. It has been an absolutely wonderful conversation with you, Professor Berkin. And again, this incredible book, thank you for writing it. For our audience out there, if you are interested in purchasing Revolutionary Mothers, please go to bookshop.org, the Gilda Lehrman page. We've shared the link. If you buy it through bookshop.org, not only does it help support the Gilda Lehrman Institute, it also helps support independent bookshops around the country as well.
Very important. Yes.
Absolutely, very important. And after we're done with the program, if you wouldn't mind just filling out the quick survey, you'll be sent right to the survey after the program ends. And if you would, hopefully you'll be all able to join us next Sunday, August 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when we're joined by Professor Kelly Carter-Jackson, and she'll be speaking about her book, Force and Freedom. And if you're interested in learning anything more about book breaks, just go to gildalehrman.org/book breaks. And if you're interested in learning about any of the other great programs that Gilda Lehrman has to offer, just go to gildalehrman.org. And we've shared the link. Professor Berkin also did a self-paced course with us, Women in the American Revolution. So highly recommend that. Again, Professor Berkin, a giant thank you. I've absolutely loved speaking with you today. It's been a real treat. Allison, thank you for collecting and asking all those great questions. And you, our audience out there, another giant thank you for joining us on this Sunday afternoon. We're all going to log off here, but we're going to leave this screen up for about 5 minutes so you can write down these links if you feel you need to. But please remember that you'll be getting an email in the next day or so with all these links available as well. So thank you and have a great afternoon.
I enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm so glad. All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.